So changing our world by changing our minds. Powerful thought, isn't it? Any of us who are alive in the world today have seen major social changes, radical social changes throughout our lives, have we not? There's been some big ones, and we still need a lot more, don't we? In our lifetimes, we've had sudden upheavals. We've had changes thrust upon us. We've had changes that have gradually arisen from the groundswell. All sorts of changes. But most of them have been brought about, initiated by people who dare to think differently and dare to take a stand on it. And I think immediately of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court judge who did so much good work in the United States. And her long journey to get there and to do what she got to do. She actually had a degree in government and I think political science from Cornell University before she went to Harvard Law School in the 1950s, one of about 5 women from a class of 300. She was married during her studies. She had a baby during her studies. She had a husband who developed cancer during her studies. She went to all of his classes as well as her own to take notes for him. When she graduated at the top of the class, the first in the class, she had degrees from both Columbia and Harvard. She could not get hired. She could not get hired in New York City, the most litigious city in the world and the most litigious country in the world. Lawyers everywhere, she could not get a job because they were afraid that the clients might think she was one of the secretaries kind of horning in on the lawyer's job, and she might get pregnant. So because she couldn't practice law, she taught law. She was a professor of law at Harvard. And she did some pro bono work for the American Civil Liberties Union. And this was the time when civil rights, women's rights, all these things were just happening. And so she took on a case for them, a test case, to challenge all these laws that were based on sexual discrimination. Ironically, the claimant in the case was not a woman, but a man. Of all the laws, they had a tax law that a woman who quit her job in order to care for an elderly parent could claim her expenses, but a man could not. Presumably, a man would never stoop so low as to do something that way. Anyway, she won that case. And the opposition defended by saying that to overturn this law would lead to overturning other laws and create radical social change and ruin the American family. She countered that they were protecting the culture and morality and traditions of an America that no longer existed. Can you relate to that? Remember the 50s and 60s? She said, a court not be affected by the weather of the day, but will be by the climate of the era, pointing out that we were into a brand new era here. And her closing argument to the judge was, we're not asking you to change the country. That's already happened without any court's permission. We are asking you to protect the right of the country to change. Right? And that case learned to overturning 178 other laws that discriminated against women based on sex. So I have benefited tremendously from this woman's work, and many women like her, have you not? Not just the women, but the men have benefited. But you know, in the 60s and 70s, remember the fear we had around using the word feminist? Remember? You were really reluctant to use it because they thought we were all lesbian, man-hating socialists. Remember that? Yeah. Now, everybody's a feminist, right? There's no question about it. And I think, going on from that, I think of Myrtle and Charles Fillmore, who developed Unity. And I think they hesitated to not use the word that is in question here, and that is Christian. Christianity, which represented the way things were in their world. And they were changing things in the religiosity of the United States. In the late 19th century, when they were writing and thinking and teaching, they lived in the Bible Belt of the USA, Kansas City, Missouri. And that was a time where they were just coming from Christianity. They were immersed in it because Christianity was another word for good people, right? Good people. I'm a good Christian man, and it was synonymous. So I don't think they ever considered calling themselves anything but Christian, but they needed to do something a little different. And they called their movement practical Christianity because they were reading the Bible not as a literal history, but as allegory and a symbolic teaching with a much deeper meaning. So they continued to call themselves Christian, but they called their teachings practical Christianity because it offered tools for living. It was relevant to the climate of the era. It wasn't necessarily changing the church, it was giving the church permission to change. You follow where I'm going with this? And to align, through the 50s, 60s, 70s, there were scientific discoveries that just didn't merge with a lot of us were taught. And so they wanted a teaching that could align to include scientific studies and to stand up to the questions of genuine seekers. Now, speaking of literal Bible interpretations, another person I want to tell you about is Clayton Pearson, Pastor Clayton Pearson. He comes from a very evangelical Pentecostal Christian background, which generally uses literal Bible interpretations. And this man has been, the reason I found out about him, he's been interviewed in both Science of Mind and Unity magazines. At one time, he was the pastor of Higher Dimensions Family Church, which is a huge church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where he had an average weekly attendance of 6,000 people. And Pastor Pearson was touring the country doing revivals, and he was huge. And he was being groomed to succeed Oral Roberts. Remember Oral Roberts? He was made a bishop at a very young age. He was living the dream. He had a beautiful wife and kids and a nice home, and the whole thing was going great. And then one day he watched the news, and he noticed the genocide in Rwanda. And he was deeply, deeply moved by this, and he struggled for a while. So the next Sunday, he said to his congregation, he said, and this may sound a little familiar because I've said something like this. I'm sure you probably have too. I said, God, I don't know how you can call yourself a loving God and let these people suffer like this. I said, none of them are saved. They don't know Christ. They're not born again. And when they die, you just suck them down to hell. And then I heard a voice as clear as my own say, is that what you think, that we're sucking them all down to hell when they die? And I said, yes. And he said, what would you do about that? And I said, well, we got to get him saved. Got to speak the gospel to him. And he said, well, if that's what you think will get him saved, then put your baby down, turn off your big screen TV, and get on the first thing smoking and go get him saved. I imagine that in good Morgan Freeman voice, And I said, God, don't put that guilt on me. I've given you the best 40 years of my life. Besides, I can't save the whole world. And he said, precisely. You can't save this world. That's what we did. Murmurs began to circulate in the congregation. He said, stay with me. All my life I've been taught it. Everything I know points to a choice, heaven or hell. Many people I love, members of my own family, went to hell, and they're there for good. Now, I could never reconcile that, but I do accept it because they had a choice. But when did these people in Africa separate from God? When did they make a choice? And how do they get saved? And he said, they don't need to be saved. They're already saved. And I've taken them into my presence. They will be with me in heaven. At this point, the murmurs became a commotion and then a disruption. And then people started getting up to leave. Over the next few months, his congregation dwindled to less than 1,000. and the church was foreclosed upon. But Carlton Pearson was a thinker. Finally, his questioning had been triggered by what was happening in Rwanda. But haven't you ever said those same questions? How can a loving God let this happen? We've all had similar misgivings because we were taught things that might not necessarily still be true if there ever were. So Carlton Pearson began preaching something called universal reconciliation, also called universal salvation. And in Christian theology, it's the doctrine that all sinful and alienated human souls, because of divine love and mercy, will ultimately be reconciled with God. That's kind of nice, isn't it? And that's radical change for some people. But not as much radical change as our position here at Unity, that there actually is no heaven or hell, right? That heaven and hell are states of consciousness that create either great suffering or great joy. And we've all had both of those, have we not? We've all been in hell, we've all been in heaven. And they're not actual physical places, and we never have really been separated from God ever, except in our consciousness. That's pretty radical, but it certainly changed my little world. So Carlton Pearson gradually lost his influence in the ministry, and the Joint College of African American Pentecostal Bishops was eventually declared him a heretic and excommunicated from the church. But since then, he has been the senior minister of Christ Universal Temple, a large New Thought congregation, that's what we are, in Chicago, head of a new Higher Dimensions Fellowship in Chicago, and was an affiliate minister at Tulsa's All Souls Unitarian Church. So he's kind of come to the light, come over to our side. But again, radical social change, some of it doesn't look necessarily positive at the time. But radical social change begins normally with one individual being open to rethinking things, changing a mind, and taking a stand. We need more radical change, yes, individually in our world, and yes, in unity. Well, maybe not radical, but we still need some, right? Somebody reminded me the other day of the first time I was a guest speaker at Unity, and people were kind of looking at each other, what's she doing? What is she doing? What's she doing? And they were a little surprised at what I was saying, but they were also willing to listen, open minds and open hearts. Because as I recall, what I was talking about was the need for unity and new thought and all faith paths to be relevant to the time we're living in, to be sensitive to the climate of our era, and to be practical and useful. So we do that. We do that here at Unity. We remind ourselves and each other of what we know. We remind ourselves and each other of the natural healing power within our own bodies. Unity was built on the mind-body connection, on the wonderful healings experienced by both the Fillmores. We remind each other and ourselves of the 12 powers we all possess, and we can activate it any time. And, I've just got a habit now whenever I'm challenged. That's fairly frequently. I just say to myself, all right, which of my 12 powers do I need to activate to help me in this situation? It's usually understanding. But, it can be any one of faith, strength, wisdom, love, power, imagination, understanding, will, order, zeal, elimination, or life, right? It's amazing how many times the power that we can activate that does the big job is elimination. How often do we need to let something go? But we do. We come here and remind ourselves and each other of that. We remind ourselves of our 5 basic principles, don't we? I hope we do. Principle number 1, God is all there is. So everything in our physical world has been created by the one divine universal being, mind, force, power, thinking upon itself to draw out of itself everything that we experience as physical. Therefore, everything is God. God is everywhere and in and as each one of us. We're all divine. That's why we sang, I love myself the way I am this morning, right? The third thing is our word has creative power, because being made of God stuff, creator, every word, every thought, every action, every belief, every expectation is shaping our reality. And the fourth one is that we access our powers, and I won't say we connect with the divine, but remind ourselves of our connection with the divine through prayer and meditation. And the fifth one is it's not enough to just know, we have to live the truth. We have to take a stand. We have to take a stand. So that's where we come here. You know, the first time I changed the words to a song, I heard it. But you know, there's still a lot more words I'd like to change. Because I don't think Myrtle and Charles Fillmore decreed that their particular words should be repeated rotely without thinking forever and ever. Charles Fillmore is famous for having said, I reserve the right to change my mind. If we're thinking and growing, of course we're going to change some things, right? And change is not an event, it's a process. It's an unfolding of a flowering, a growth or progression. So I don't want to change the eternal truths. I want to change the way we talk about the eternal truths, the way we interpret them sometimes, the way we express the truths, the way we transmit those truths to others, to our children, in a way that's relevant to the seekers of today. And so a way that will land in the hearts of those who desperately want to answer those questions. You know, who am I? What am I doing here? How can a loving God let this happen? Where am I going? What's it all about? Elfie, remember? And so one more thing is, you all know that I avoid using pronouns for God. Back in 1970, remember Helen Reddy's I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar? She won a Grammy for that. And in her acceptance speech, she said, I want to thank my agent, I want to thank my husband, and I want to thank God because she makes things happen. And I was like, ooh. And for a while, we had a little goddess, fascination. We talked about the feminine face of God and all that stuff. And that was a change, and something that was a radical change. But not, for me, not radical enough, because it still humanized God. And to make God equal to human is, to me, to belittle God, to make a mockery of what God is. Because God is not a human. God is a process, a force, the infinite and eternal force of the universe. So to me, God is not a he, is not a she, is not an it, and is not even a you. And I know that's hard when you're in prayer or something and you're expressing gratitude, not to say thank you, God, or thank you, Spirit, because that's how we do express gratitude. But for me, I'm always going, no, God is not you, because definition of you used to refer to the person, I got a lot of P's in here, haven't I? or people that the speaker is addressing, or to any person in general. And God is not a person. So for me personally, I say, I am grateful. But I know a lot of people just like to say, thank you, God, because that's the more personal way they can relate. But that's unity. What feels good to you. But please don't think that God is a big man, Because I think ultimately it's this personification of God that gives rise to all these rules and regulations and restrictions and taboos, because we assume that God thinks like a person. Those didn't come from God. They came from people who were trying to understand God as a man. Follow me? And the next thing I'll tackle, if it hasn't been enough already, is this idea of God as having a will or a plan for you, of wanting you to make certain choices or act in a prescribed way. So the implication there is that God is like your parents, full of rules and regulations, even if they are just there to protect you. No, God wants you to grow and learn and think for yourself. I think. But then who am I? Because we don't know whether, okay. So there are many opportunities for each of us to influence the climate of our era today, opportunities for us to be relevant and order a practical teaching, or offer a practical teaching. I've often heard people say they come here because they like to meet people of like mind. Anybody ever said that? It's so nice to think people who think like I do. I got news for you. We are probably the least like-minded people in the world. You know, the only thing we have in common about our minds is our willingness to change them and our willingness to open them, to look at different ideas and interpretations and look at things openly without a judgment because it's not what I heard before, it's not the right thing. You know, that's what we have in common. We have different minds and we're willing to share that and talk about that and not judge each other and accept each other and love each other. If you want like-minded people, go on down to the Catholic Church or become a Jehovah's Witness. Everybody thinks like there, you know, go ahead. I like being willing to change, being willing to grow. Because to me, the purpose of unity is not to make our lives all hunky-dory, though it may very well do that. The purpose of unity is to equip us to handle the uncomfortableness of life with love and grace. We are bigger than our fears and our judgments. We're bigger than all of that. And unity gives us permission and gives us courage. It's amazing you chose that word this morning, to take a stand. You know, it's this teaching that gives me the courage to stand up for what I think is right. Like Carlson Pearson did, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg did, and like Myrtle and Charles Fillmore did. Permission to change, right? We're not here to question and change things. We're here to give each other permission to change and take a stand. So when I think about what my stand is, I can only think of Jesus' one commandment: love one another. That's where I stand. Namaste.